Well, Byron published the first two cantos of his poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. The poem features a protagonist, Childe Harold, who I think it's fair to say presents a new kind of hero in British literature. A hero so distinctive and so inseparable from its creator that the hero is called the Byronic Hero. And we still use this language today to talk about certain kinds of protagonists or heroes in literature and film and television. Childe Harold, in the poem, long poem about Byron's travels throughout Europe, is sullen, melancholy, tempestuous, perhaps violent, rebellious, indifferent toward taboos, dark, bad, but at the same time vulnerable and capable of deep feeling, and also very racked with guilt over some horrific crime he's committed in the past. He's also very interested in sexuality. Childe Harold is very interested in heterosexuality, I should say. His sexuality takes that form basically in the poem, though Byron himself was bisexual. So the persona that Byron creates in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, many of his readers immediately thought was not a persona at all, but indeed Lord Byron, an autobiographical portrait of this young man. One reason for this is that Byron was already known to possess some of the qualities of Childe Harold. When he was at Cambridge, Byron was a notorious hedonist. He was constantly drinking and carousing. He was violent. He carried guns everywhere. He was always shooting at things. He was a good boxer and brawled from time to time. He was very sexual. He had sex with women and men quite frequently. Apparently, at his Newstead Manor, Newstead Abbey, he and his fellow students drank wine from a skull that they dug up from the garden. So he was blasphemous in some ways, transgressing various conventions. So all this together made Childe Harold seem to be but a very accurate mask for Lord Byron. And indeed, there are some ways that Childe Harold was an accurate mask for Lord Byron, but it's not that simple. Byron publishes the first two cantos of Childe Harold, 1812, publishes two more later. And he became wildly famous. He famously said, "I woke up one morning to find myself famous." The Childe Harold's Pilgrimage flew off the shelves, and Byron became the first massive literary celebrity in English literary history. Men wanted to dress like him and did. Men wanted to behave like him and did. They became sullen and melancholy and dark and brooding. Women wanted to be with him. It was like he was a rock star. Women would line up outside of his rooms in London, and he couldn't come outside. So he was like the Beatles to some extent, or like Elvis, maybe we might say. And what made him so famous was this hero, or at least partially what made him so famous was this hero known as the Byronic Hero. So what does Byron do? Immediately, he writes many other literary works with a similar kind of hero. We see Childe Harold show up again in cantos 3 and 4 of Childe Harold. We see this figure show up in a play called Manfred. We see it show up in a poem called the Giaour. Byron knew he had something good going. And like, say, an actor who knows he or she they're good at playing a certain role and keeps playing it. This is what Byron did to a certain extent in his literature. I will say, though, that by the time Byron starts writing his true masterwork, Don Juan, I announced the J purposefully. Byron's rhyme scheme in the poem suggests that we should not say Don Juan, but Don Juan. He mocks this persona. And even in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage 3, he mocks this persona. So Byron always had an irony about the Byronic hero. He knew this was a mask. He knew this was a role he could play, one among many roles he could play. He liked being famous, so he manipulated that image, let's call it his brand, so he could stay famous. But he always knew it was a brand. He knew it was a game. But this idea of the Byronic hero, sometimes called the anti-hero, has really thrived in a lot of fiction throughout the 19th century in particular, and in film and television. The models for this so-called Byronic hero are ancient, though. They're mythical. Prometheus is an example of the Byronic hero. Prometheus is a rebel. He transgresses the very laws of heaven and suffers great punishment for it. But why does he rebel so strongly? In hopes of helping humans live better lives. Cain. Yes, Cain murders his brother Abel, but from a kind of Gnostic point of view, or a counter point of view, if you see the God who created Cain and Abel as somehow less than a god, maybe even evil, for Cain to break the laws of this God would be seen less as a negative and a positive. Same for Satan. Satan, as he shows up in Paradise Lost, can be seen as an early example of the anti-hero. But the anti-hero really thrives in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein is the consummate anti-hero. He's brilliant. He's a genius, and he's beloved by his family and by his friends, but yet he's addicted to death and graveyards, and he creates a creature that he doesn't take care of. So in some ways he's morally bankrupt, selfish, but yet endlessly fascinating to those who are around him. And we see this character play out in Heathcliff, in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, and her sister Charlotte. Charlotte Bronte presents another Byronic hero in Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre. But more recent examples in film of the Byronic hero, we can think, in this regard, of well, I think the way Batman is presented in the Nolan series, Bruce Wayne / Batman is a kind of anti-hero, Byronic hero, dark, brooding, consumed, addicted to violence, but yet seemingly working for good. I guess you could even say that in the Marvel Comics universe, Tony Stark is a kind of Byronic hero. He's the bad boy, but yet he's also good at the same time. I would say that the more recent Byronic heroes that treat the persona ironically, like Byron himself did, would be John Wick, played by Keanu Reeves. Again, a hyper-violent character, but is ultimately killing people because his puppy was was murdered. But Keanu Reeves plays this character quite brilliantly, I think, tongue-in-cheek. He knows he knows it's ridiculous to be this over-the-top in violence, and therefore kind of makes fun of the character while he's playing the character. And I think we see Harrison Ford do this in the 3 Star Wars films he was in. Now, one might ask, is this character, the Byronic hero, always a heterosexual white male? Well, historically, yes. This character has tended to be that because it grew out of this model of Byron casting himself in Childe Harold as a hyper heterosexual white male, even though, of course, Byron himself, as I said, was bisexual. He had many affairs with many men. I think we can see some female so-called Byronic heroes, though we need a different name for that, I think. You can have the Sarah Connor character in the Terminator films, the second one in particular, or think of Sigourney Weaver's. Sorry, I had trouble saying that. Her character Ripley in the Alien and Aliens, the first 2 films of that film sequence. But it'd be interesting to think about Byronic heroes existing in other contexts. Can there be bisexual Byronic heroes? Well, yes, but what would be the name for that? Transgender, what would be the name for that? So I think we might need to expand our vocabulary for thinking about characters who are both violent and vulnerable, transgressive yet attractive at the same time, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation, indeed regardless of race. One could imagine that to be the Byronic hero, you need to start from a position of cultural power, because you can afford to transgress the rules and still thrive. Byron was a peer, he was a lord, so he was occupied a place very high in his society. If he were marginalized, if he were impoverished, I doubt he would construct such a persona as this. So I think that class plays into the Byronic hero, and race too. Again, Byron was a white man in a culture that valued whiteness. Would a person of color be able to generate the Byronic hero in the way that Byron did at that time? So these are all interesting questions that take us beyond what Byron's doing with the Byronic hero, and asks us to think about different ways to name heroes that aren't simply good, and heroes that aren't simply evil, but heroes that somehow are in between, and it is precisely their in-betweenness that makes them attractive.